There is a sound that never ceases in Skyrim, though few still hear it. It moves through the bones of the mountains like a buried wind, low and patient, as if the world itself were breathing. Some say it is the whisper of Kain, mother of men, and giver of the voice. Others believe it is the memory of dragons, whose tongues once shaped the very air into command. Yet whatever name one gives it, the echo remains, ancient, unseen, eternal. It is the pulse beneath the snow. It is the song beneath all silence. In the north, the sky bends close to the earth. Clouds drift like worn banners above the peaks, their edges lit by a sun that seldom warms. To the land lies in the shadow of great stone spines, the Jurgen Mountains to the south, the Velorthi to the east, and above them all, the throat of the world. There, the breath of the gods gathers, and the thin air trembles with memory. To stand upon its summit is to be between worlds, where the words of creation first rose like dawn over chaos. The Nords call this place the heart of the voice, and the old songs say that every wind that blows across Skyrim once passed through that sacred height. In the earliest ages, before kings and before the reckoning of time, men came from Atmora and found dragons already enthroned in the sky. These were not mere beasts, but beings of spirit and word, their speech so pure that the mountains bent before them. To speak was to will, and to will was to make. The Thu'um, the voice, was not learned, but lived, the divine breath of Aetherius clothed in mortal air. Men knelt before it, fearing and worshipping in equal measure. They built their cities around dragon shrines, and offered their dead to the flame, believing that to be consumed by a dragon was to be remembered forever. Such was the first faith of Skyrim, devotion to power that could not be questioned. But faith breeds rebellion, as shadow follows flame. In time, men grew weary of the yoke of their scaled lords. Some learned the secret syllables of power, stolen or gifted in mercy, and turned them back upon their masters. The sky itself became a battlefield of breath and thunder. Words clashed like swords, and mountains cracked where voices met. When the last cry of that war faded, dragons lay buried beneath stone and ice, and men stood upon their graves, victorious, but changed. For in seizing the voice, they had inherited not merely its strength, but its weight. Yet victory did not bring peace. The same power that could topple dragons could also shatter kingdoms. The Thu'um became a weapon wielded by jarls and warlords who sought dominion in the name of glory. The earth trembled beneath their shouts. The air burned with their pride. The voice, once sacred, became an instrument of conquest, and amid the noise of endless war, the true sound of the world, the soft breath of life itself, was nearly forgotten. Still, there were those who listened, high in the mountains, beyond the reach of kings and the din of ambition. A few began to wonder whether power and purpose were meant to share the same breath. They listened not to the cries of battle, but to the spaces between them. They began to hear something else, a gentler rhythm beneath all things. Among them was a warrior named Jurgen Windcaller, who would one day hear that silence so clearly that it would undo an age of shouting. But that tale is not yet ready to begin. For now, imagine the mountain as it stands, vast, white, and waiting. The wind gathers in the hollows, shaping words that no one speaks. The sky drifts, the snow falls, and the echo endures. It is patient as stone. It is older than dragons, and it waits, as it always has, for one who will listen. Chapter 1. The Voice as Fire. In the beginning, the voice was not prayer. It was power. It burned through the air like the first dawn tearing open the dark. Those who spoke it did not plead to the gods, for their words themselves were divine. To utter was to command, to breathe was to bind, and the dragons were the first to know this truth. They moved above the frozen world in slow spirals, vast and knowing, their wings stirring the snow into clouds that fell like ash. From their throats came thunder that carried meaning, and with that meaning came law. Their words built empires of flame and faith. They spoke, and mountains bowed. They named, and mortals obeyed. For the dragons did not simply speak of domination, they were domination given voice. It was Alduin who led them, the firstborn of Akatosh, the world eater who saw time as a circle and himself as its keeper. He and his kin ruled not by sword, but by sound. Around them gathered the dragon priests, men who believed that to serve such beings was to serve eternity, clad in masks of power and robes of gold-threaded faith. They built the great temples that still stand in ruin, cold as tombs. Through them, the worship of dragons became the worship of order, for to resist was to invite the end of all breath. But men are born to question, even as they kneel. From among the slaves and supplicants rose whispers, first of wonder, then of doubt, and at last of rebellion. They asked why a god who ruled the skies would require men to dig his graves. They asked if power was truth, or if truth was something still waiting to be spoken, and in that doubt lay the seed of the dragon war. Cain, the mother of men, took pity upon her children. Seeing their suffering, she wept upon the winds, and her tears became the storm that shattered the heavens. It is said she taught men to speak as dragons do, not to enslave, but to defend. From her breath came the first shouts of defiance. Men learned the words that could wound the air itself. They spoke, and the sky answered. Thus began an age of thunder. The voice, once the language of gods, became the cry of mortals rising from the dust. The mountains trembled beneath their fury. Dragon battled dragon, man battled master. The world rang with the clamor of shouts, and for a time it seemed even the stars might fall from their places. The air itself was weapon and witness. It was in this crucible that the Thu'um became both gift and curse. For every victory born of its power, there came ruin equal in measure. Villages burned, not by fire, but by syllables too strong for mortal lungs. The boundaries of mercy and destruction blurred, until no one could tell whether Cain's gift was salvation or punishment. When at last Alduin fell, cast from the world by the same voice he had once commanded, the silence that followed was deep and terrible. The dragons were broken, the priests entombed, and men stood upon the ashes of their gods. Yet though their mouths were quiet, the echo of that power remained, coiled within them like a sleeping storm. The voice was theirs now, but so too was its burden. And so the world entered a long winter of uncertainty. Heroes shouted for glory, kings for dominion, and poets for remembrance. The mountains became altars of ambition, where the air itself bent to mortal will. None yet understood that the truest strength of the voice was not in its fire, but in its silence. None, save one who would come to hear that silence, as clearly as a song. In the ages that followed, stories of the dragon war faded into legend, and legend into dust. Temples crumbled. The tongues who once sang the words of fire wandered without purpose, teaching no more. Yet in the high snows, the wind still carried faint syllables, fragments of a forgotten conversation between gods and men. And somewhere, far from the feasting halls and the cries of kings, a warrior named Jurgen Windcaller, began to listen. The world had shouted itself hoarse, and in that hoarseness, he heard the truth waiting to be spoken anew. Chapter 2. The Silence of Jurgen Windcaller. There are moments in history when the world holds its breath, waiting for one soul to hear what all others have forgotten. Jurgen Windcaller was such a soul, a warrior of great renown. He had once fought as fiercely as any Nord, his voice thundering across battlefields that shook with pride and blood. His name was sung in the mead halls and carried in the wind like a promise of victory. Yet victory is a sound that fades quickly, and Jurgen's would end in silence. It is told that Jurgen marched to Red Mountain with 700 of his kin, bearing the full might of the voice against the Dunmer. They went to war in the name of glory, as all Nords do. But when the mountain roared and the sky split open, their shouts were swallowed by something greater, something that rendered even the voice meaningless. The wind turned against them, the ground devoured them, and Jurgen Windcaller was left to face what no warrior can fight, the quiet aftermath of failure. He returned to Skyrim, a man unmade. His companions were dust, their words scattered into the ash. No songs awaited him in the long halls, no feasts, no crowns. The bards speak little of this journey home, for it was not triumphant, but hollow. He climbed into the mountains, away from men, seeking no glory and no comfort. There, in the shadow of the throat of the world, he sat for 7 years and 7 nights and listened. At first, he heard only the storm rage without reason, echoing his own heart. The wind battered him, the snow cut like memory, and hunger gnawed at what little pride remained. But slowly, through the endless noise, he began to hear something deeper, a rhythm beneath the world's violence, a harmony that did not shout yet never ceased. It was not the song of victory, nor the lament of loss. It was the breath of all things, the same that stirred the seas, the same that filled the lungs of gods and men alike. In that stillness, Jurgen understood. The voice was not meant for conquest, but communion. To speak was not to command, but to join the world in its eternal conversation. The true strength of the Thu'um was not in bending the air, but in becoming one with it. In silence, he found the truest shout of all. When Jurgen descended the mountain, his eyes were changed. He spoke softly, and the air itself seemed to listen. Those who met him said that his presence calmed the storms. Where others saw defeat, he carried revelation. He taught that shouting for dominion was folly, that the voice, when wielded without understanding, was nothing but noise. To raise one's voice in anger was to drown out the song of creation, but to listen, to truly listen, was to hear the gods themselves. Many mocked him. The world does not easily trust peace. The tongues who had once been warriors scorned his new creed, calling it cowardice. They continued their wars, believing that the gods favored the loudest. Yet Jurgen did not answer them with words. He built instead a hall of stone high upon the mountain, where the wind could speak without interruption. He named it High Hrothgar, and there he meditated in silence, letting the snow bury his doubts and the years erode his name. Over time, others came, those weary of endless noise, those who sought the still voice beneath the storm. Jurgen welcomed them not as followers, but as listeners. He taught them to breathe, to feel the air as a living thing, to hear the unspoken syllables between heartbeats. They became the Greybeards, monks of quiet power, who spoke not to rule, but to remember. Their shouts were few, their words deliberate. The mountain became their temple, the wind their scripture, It is said that when Jurgen Windcaller died, he did not fall, he simply stopped speaking, and the air carried his final breath upward, as if the world itself were drawing it in. And on certain nights, when the peaks are clear and the stars unshuttered, travelers claim to hear a whisper across the sky, a low hum like the first note of a word never finished. Perhaps it is only the wind, or perhaps it is Jurgen, still listening. Chapter 3. The Monks of the Throat. High upon the slopes of the throat of the world, where air thins to crystal and the sky leans close enough to touch, the disciples of Jurgen Windcaller built their refuge of stone and silence. It was not a fortress, though its walls endured more winters than any king's hall, nor was it a temple in the manner of priests, for no idols stood within, and no offerings burned upon its hearth. High Hrothgar was instead a listening place, a monastery raised to the soundless rhythm of the breath. The first of the Greybeards came one by one, drawn by dreams and omens, by voices heard in the wind that carried no words. Some were warriors weary of conquest, their throats scarred from shouting the Thu'um. Some were scholars who had searched too long for truths that could not be written. Others were hermits who sought only peace, but found in Jurgen's silence something greater than rest. He welcomed them not as acolytes, but as echoes, each to find his own stillness in the mountain's endless song. In those early years, they spoke seldom. Days passed without a single word. Their discipline was breath itself, slow, deliberate, unbroken. They learned to shape the air, not into shouts, but into understanding. They meditated upon each syllable of the world's making, believing that every mountain, every tree, every drifting snowflake carried a fragment of the voice within it. To hear the world was to know it was to honor it. Thus silence became their worship, and listening their prayer. When storms howled around the peaks, the Greybeards sat unmoving. When lightning split the clouds, they closed their eyes and counted the spaces between the thunder. In those spaces, they heard the divine rhythm that joined all things, the slow pulse of existence itself. They called it the voice unspoken, the eternal breath that preceded all creation, and in that awareness, they found a power greater than any shout of war. Visitors sometimes climbed the 7,000 steps to their door, bearing offerings of food, wine, or questions. Few were turned away, but fewer still received answers. The Greybeards did not teach as scholars do. Their lessons were moments, glances, silences, or the faint turning of the wind that followed a question. Those who came seeking power left with humility. Those who came seeking meaning left with patience. The mountain gave only what the heart could hear. There are tales of kings who came to seek their counsel. One such was High King Wulfharth, whose own voice had once shaken walls to dust. When he demanded that the Greybeards speak, they merely bowed their heads, and the echo of his anger broke upon their calm. In time, even he fell silent, hearing the futility of his own shouting. It is said that when he left High Hrothgar, he whispered instead of roared, and the mountains answered him gently. Through the centuries, the order endured unchanged. Empires rose and fell, gods were worshipped and forgotten, but the Greybeards remained, keepers of the breath that binds the world. They took no sides, swore to no king, and marched beneath no banner. When war swept across Skyrim, they listened. When peace returned, they listened still. Their only allegiance was to the wind itself. Among them, one name was spoken only in reverence, Jurgen Windcaller. Though his body had long returned to the snow, his presence lingered in the halls he built. It was said that his spirit could be felt in the stillness, after prayer, in the faint hum of the air between the stones. New initiates would sometimes hear a low whisper in the night, instructing them in tones too soft for meaning, but heavy with understanding. They called this the breath of Jurgen, and it was believed to be his way of ensuring that silence never hardened into ignorance. In time, the monastery itself became a part of the mountain. Snow swallowed its steps, frost sealed its doors, and the world below began to forget. But the Greybeards did not mind. To be forgotten was to be freed. They remained upon their sacred height, bound not by duty, but by peace. To them, every gust of wind was a verse, every snowfall a hymn. They lived in the shadow of the sky, and in that shadow they found light. Thus the way of the voice endured, not as fire, not as weapon, but as whisper. The Greybeards held fast to the belief that power untempered by wisdom is destruction, and that true mastery lies not in shouting the loudest, but in knowing when to remain silent. And though few ever reached their halls, the faint echo of their teaching drifted down into the valleys below, carried by the wind that touches all things. Somewhere, perhaps, a child would pause in play to listen to that whisper and wonder what it meant, and in that wondering, the voice would live again. Chapter 4. The Word and the World. There are truths too vast to be spoken, yet all language is born from the attempt. The Greybeards taught that the world itself began as a word, an utterance from beyond time that became sky, stone, and soul. Very sound sense has been an echo of that first breath, a remembrance of creation's origin. Thus the voice is not a tool, but a mirror, reflecting the balance between word and world, between the mortal will and the divine harmony that underlies all being. To the unlearned, the Thu'um seems a force of destruction, a cry that rends the air and shatters the mountain. But to the wise, it is the speech of balance. Every shout contains both command and surrender, for to shape the world, one must also be shaped by it. The air that carries a word is the same that grants life. To misuse it is to harm oneself. Jurgen Windcaller understood this, that mastery over the voice was not the conquest of breath, but the yielding to its rhythm. The monks of High Hrothgar meditated upon this truth endlessly. They listened to the wind as it moved through narrow halls, through cracks in the stone, through the branches of the lone trees that clung to the cliffs below. In those sounds, they heard the structure of existence, the rise and fall, the inhalation and release, the endless giving and returning that binds all living things. To them, the world was not a place, but a vast conversation. Every river was a sentence, every snowfall a pause, and man, with his brief and burning life, was but a syllable in that eternal dialogue. They taught that to speak without harmony was to invite discord, and that each word carried a weight upon the soul. This belief became the foundation of their discipline. When a novice entered the monastery, he did not begin with the study of shouts, but with silence. He learned to breathe without desire, to exhale without intent. Only after years of stillness could he be trusted with sound, for to speak a word of power without understanding was to shout against the heartbeat of the world, and the world, they said, always answered. Legends tell of one novice who, in youthful impatience, attempted to shout before his training was complete. His cry split the air and called down an avalanche that buried him and 3 of his brothers. When the snow finally settled, the monks uncovered his body still kneeling, his mouth frozen open mid-syllable. They built no grave for him. Instead, they let him remain beneath the snow as a reminder that power divorced from wisdom is only noise. Through such lessons, the monks came to understand the deeper nature of the voice. They no longer saw it as a gift for mortals alone, but as the language through which all reality speaks to itself. The wind across the tundra, the whisper of leaves, the crack of thunder, all are fragments of the same word, spoken endlessly through time. To shout is to join in that chorus. To misuse the shout is to fall out of tune. They believed also that the gods themselves continued this dialogue, though mortals hear only faint echoes. Kaina breathes through every gust. Akatosh turns the seasons like the turning of a great page. Even the Daedra, in their distant realms, are syllables of defiance that nonetheless depend upon the same breath. In all things, the voice persists, shaping and shaped. Occasionally, travelers who braved the 7,000 steps would find themselves caught in strange moments, silences too profound for mere weather, as if the mountain itself paused to listen. Those who lingered claimed to hear words beyond words, the faint hum of creation's memory vibrating in their chests. Few could bear it for long. Most fled in tears, unable to contain the enormity of what they had felt. The Greybeards would only smile and say that the mountain had spoken their name. Thus the word and the world remained entwined, inseparable and infinite. To live was to breathe was to speak was to shape and be shaped in return. The monks knew that even the smallest whisper carries the weight of that truth, and so they guarded their tongues, for every syllable cast into the air rippled outward forever. At night, when the wind fell still and the sky turned to glass, they would sit in quiet communion and listen to their own breath mingling with the pulse of the world. In those moments they claimed to hear the echo of the first word, the sound that began all things. Some called it the voice of Kain, others the dream of Akatosh, but most spoke no name for it at all, fearing that to name it would divide it. Better, they said, to let it remain what it has always been, the silence that holds the sound. And in that silence, the world continued to speak. Chapter 5. The Call of the Dragonborn. Time moves strangely in Skyrim. The snows remember more than the songs of men, and the mountains whisper of cycles that return like breath itself. Empires rise and falter, faith burns and cools, but the wind endures. And so, when the age of silence stretched too long, when even the Greybeards' patience began to tremble beneath the weight of prophecy, the voice stirred once more. It did not begin with a shout, but with a whisper carried on the cold air, a single name, spoken by the world itself, Dovahkiin. Long had the monks of Hrothgar waited for this moment, though few among them dared to believe it would come. The ancient text spoke of a soul born with the blood of dragons and the body of man, destined to bridge the rift between silence and storm, not a conqueror nor a servant, but a balance. For as much as the world had learned to fear the voice, it had forgotten the purpose of its gift, to keep time in harmony, to renew what had been broken. When Alduin returned, devouring the skies of Skyrim, as he had once devoured the ages, it was as if the past itself had risen to devour the present. The dragon priests stirred in their tombs, and the shouts of the long dead echoed once again through the frozen valleys. Men cried out for heroes, but it was not courage that the world required, it was remembrance. And so the voice called to one who could hear what others could not. The Greybeards, hearing that ancient resonance in the distance, knew the sign. They turned their faces toward the wind, and let their words climb the air in a single call. Dovahkiin. The mountains trembled. Across Skyrim, snow slid from peaks, and rivers shuddered in their beds. To those below, it was thunder. To those who listened, It was revelation. The prophecy had awakened. In that moment, the teachings of Jurgen Windcaller were tested. The world that had once shouted itself into ruin would now need to listen anew. The Dragonborn was not sent to reclaim the glory of the past, but to restore its balance, to wield power without pride, to speak with fire, yet understand the virtue of silence. For only one who knew both could stand before Alduin and not be consumed. It is said that when the Dragonborn first stood before the Greybeards, the very stones of High Hrothgar quaked beneath his breath. The wind bent, the air thickened, and even the elders bowed, not in worship, but in recognition. Here was one who embodied the paradox they had long contemplated, the mortal voice that could echo eternity. And yet, they taught him not to shout, but to listen. For the path to power, they reminded him, begins in silence. Through their guidance, he learned that the voice is not a weapon to be raised, but a bridge to be crossed. Each shout, each word of power, was a step between the divine and the mortal. Fizz, the force that pushes back the world, becomes meaningless without Rose, the balance that restores it. And Da, the impulse that drives all things forward, is but the breath that follows understanding. The Dragonborn's journey was thus not of conquest, but of communion, of learning to hear creation's rhythm and to speak in harmony with it. When at last the battle came, the final meeting of voice and fire, the mountains bore witness in silence. Alduin roared with the fury of the first dawn, and the Dragonborn answered not as a destroyer, but as a mirror. Their shouts met, not in hatred, but in inevitability. The world trembled, and for a heartbeat, all sound ceased. Some say that in that pause, time itself held its breath, uncertain which song would resume. What followed was not victory in the mortal sense. Alduin fell, yet the echo of his being did not fade. It returned to the cycle, as all things do. The Dragonborn stood amid the stillness and exhaled, his breath merging with the wind. The prophecy fulfilled itself as quietly as it began, balance restored, not by dominance, but by understanding. The Greybeards say that every age has its own voice, that whenever the world drifts too far toward chaos or silence, one arises who can hear both. The Dragonborn is not a singular savior, but a chord in a song that never ends. The dragons rise, the world trembles, and the voice returns. So it has always been, so it shall always be. And if one stands upon the throat of the world at dawn, when the air is still and the first light touches the peaks, one may hear a faint breath carried on the wind. It speaks no name, claims no throne. It is simply the sound of balance restored, the quiet that follows understanding, the silence that completes the song. There comes a height beyond all heights, where breath itself seems unworthy to rise, upon the throat of the world, where sky and stone touch as equals. The wind carries no sound, only the memory of sound. Here the Greybeards end their pilgrimages, and here the voice finds its quiet home. Beyond this point, there is no word, no thought, only the long exhalation of creation itself. The snow does not fall so much as it drifts, weightless and eternal, as if unsure whether to descend or ascend. The air is so thin that it becomes its own kind of silence, a purity that cleanses even memory. In that stillness, one may feel the heartbeat of the world, not as a sound, but as a pulse beneath the skin of existence. It is said that those who linger too long upon this height begin to fade, not into death, but into understanding. The monks say that Jurgen Windcaller's spirit never left this place. He is the whisper in the wind that greets every climber, the unseen guide between breaths. They say he listens still, not for prayer, nor for praise, but for the music of balance, for the steady rhythm of a world that despite all its wounds continues to breathe. And perhaps that is all the gods ever desired, that their creation should remember its own harmony. To speak here is almost blasphemy. The tongue stumbles, the lungs hesitate, as though the air itself refuses to carry words that might disturb the calm. Even the Dragonborn, bearer of the greatest voice of his age, stands silent upon this peak. There is nothing left to shout, no victory to claim, no enemy to name, only the wind and the knowledge that it moves through all things, forever unbroken. From this summit, the world below seems impossibly small, its wars, its empires, its griefs, mere shadows flickering across the white. Yet even here, the echoes of those struggles rise faintly through the cold. The Greybeards say that the mountain listens to every voice, even those spoken in ignorance or rage, and in its patience finds a way to make them part of the whole. For in the end, every word, no matter how harsh, returns to silence. When the last breath leaves the last speaker, when the last flame dims and the last song fades, the voice will remain, not as sound, but as presence. The same breath that kindled the first word will linger, unseen and undying, circling through time, like a snowflake that never lands. The voice is the world, and the world is the voice. Each rises from the other, falls into the other, and begins again. So it is that the silence beyond the summit is not an ending, but a return to the breath before the first word, to the peace that precedes creation. To stand here is to hear what cannot be heard, to understand that every shout, every whisper, every life is a single note in an endless hymn. The mountain does not answer, because it is the answer. And when the wind at last stills, when the world forgets even the name of the Dragonborn, the throat of the world will continue to breathe, for silence is not the absence of sound, it is the perfection of it, the place where all voices meet and none are lost.